So the war in Ukraine, which some have pointed out for nearly 2 years now, was never going to be won by Ukraine, since Russia has a population of over 100 million more people, is finally, apparently, headed for peace talks. NATO seems to have acknowledged that this is not actually going to work. What do you make of that?
I think it's important to go back and remember what was said at the beginning, the propagandistic framework, not to take credit or assign blame, but to realize how often we're deceived by exactly the same emotionally manipulative tactics. We were told by the people who wanted the U.S. involved in this war, not just involved in it, but to fuel it, to prevent diplomatic negotiations from taking place with the possibility of ending the war very early on. We were told by those people that they were so concerned about Ukrainians and so concerned about Ukraine that the United States had to send tens of billions of dollars over there and all sorts of weaponry and flood the country with arms in order to protect Ukrainians. And anybody like the two of us and other people who stood up and said, this isn't a good idea, this is going to be counterproductive, we were accused of not caring about the Ukrainians, of cheering for the Russians, when none of that was true. All along, the point was that there was no way Ukraine could possibly win a war against Russia, a country way larger with a much better military, even if NATO is behind it. The only thing that is going to happen is that this war will be prolonged. Huge numbers of young Ukrainians and then older Ukrainians, not people who volunteered, but who are conscripts. Zelensky has been fighting with a conscript army since the beginning, are going to die, and at the end there's going to be a negotiation that says that Russia will end up being able to protect the part of eastern Ukraine it believes had people in it who are largely Russian-speaking, ethnic Russians, who are being oppressed by Kiev. They will keep Crimea. There's no way for these maximalist war aims ever to be achieved. And now here we are 2 years later, in part because the West is just tired of funding this war. The counteroffensive that we were all told would change everything was a tremendous disaster. They barely have any people left to fight. They're now dragging 45 and 50-year-olds off buses and sending them to the front. And the United States has a brand new war that it seems more excited over. And now they're finally telling the Ukrainians, and so is NATO, look, the gig is up. It's time for you to sit down at the negotiating table. And we're now in a position where NATO has to beg Russia to be happy to keep 20% of Ukraine, which is what they've controlled pretty much without any change for the last year or even year and a half, as tens of billions of dollars were wasted and thousands upon thousands of lives were extinguished.
And I would argue it's even worse than that, since the Biden administration and our European allies provoked this war on purpose. They've known for 20 years that the red line for Russia was NATO expansion onto its borders. And they sent the Vice President, Kamala Harris, to the Munich Security Conference 2 Februarys ago to tell Zelensky, we want you in NATO, knowing that this would provoke a war. I mean, I don't see any other way to read it.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that if you talk openly about providing a security relationship with Kiev, or especially talk openly about allowing NATO to go right up to the most sensitive part of the Russian border by including Ukraine in the alliance, the idea that that would provoke an automatic war with Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, is something that Washington has known for decades. There's a famous memo in 2008 written by the current head of the CIA, Bill Burns, who wrote to Condoleezza Rice and other Bush administration officials who at the time were excited about expanding NATO eastward, about putting Ukraine in NATO. And he said, look, it's not just Putin, it's every single person in Moscow, even the people who hate Putin. All Russians are united around the idea that any attempt to put Ukraine into NATO is an existential threat to Russia, and they will have no choice but to invade Ukraine if we try. And they knew that, and they ignored those threats. And I absolutely think, Tucker, that one of the things that is, I think, the greatest fraud of this war is that the people who kept claiming they were so concerned about Ukrainians were in fact totally indifferent to the Ukrainians. They were willing to sacrifice Ukrainians and Ukraine at the altar of getting back at Russia. I think in large part because they wanted to extract vengeance against Russia for what they perceived to be Russia's role in helping Donald Trump win the 2016 election and causing Hillary Clinton to lose. And they were willing to sacrifice an entire country and to wipe out tens of thousands of lives of young people who didn't want to fight in order to fulfill their political goal of extracting vengeance against Russia Russia, weakening Russia and they've been saying for the last several months, as American support for this war is eroding, oh, look at how great this war is. We don't have to lose any of our lives. We're just having Ukrainians die, and we're just spending a bunch of money, but no Americans are dying, only Ukrainians, for this goal of weakening Russia. They were the ones who didn't care about the Ukrainians. They saw Ukrainians as pawns that they were willing to sacrifice, and that's exactly what they did. It's really obscene.
This is almost a rhetorical question, but isn't this the point in the story where we pause and the people who behaved in the way you just described, which is grotesque, where they apologize for what they did and apologize to the people they maligned by calling them Putin apologists or tools of the Kremlin or disloyal Americans? Isn't that a kind of a necessary step in recovering from this disaster?
It is, but the biggest problem with our political media culture is that there is no accountability. So many of the loudest voices urging the United States get involved in this war and attacking and demonizing anybody who was opposed as being Russian agents or unpatriotic or whatever, they didn't come from the same ideological camp. In many cases, they were literally the very same people who did exactly that after 9/11, anybody who stood up and said, I'm against the Patriot Act, or I have concerns about NSA spying, or I don't think we should invade Iraq or drone bomb countries all over the world, the David Frums and the Bill Cristols and the Cheney family, those were the people standing up and saying, anyone opposed to our wars are unpatriotic, they're on the other side, and none of those people ever paid a price for what they did, lying the country into the war in Iraq, destroying a country of 26 million people that gave rise to ISIS. They, in fact, all got promoted. Jeffrey Goldberg helped sell the lie. He was one of the main people in the media selling the lie that Al-Qaeda was responsible with Saddam Hussein for planning the 9/11 attack. He's now the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. They get promoted for these lies. And so there won't be any accountability. These very same people, Victoria Nuland, are all still in power, and they're going to continue to use these tactics because they never pay a price. To the contrary, they end up getting rewarded for it.